and welcome to NOAA's National Ocean Service Science Seminar Series. My name is Tracy Gill. Today, and for all Tuesdays through May 28th, I am co-hosting a seminar series with Gyami Shrestha, Director of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program Office. And Gyami will offer some info on the background of this series. But before she does, here are some logistics and related information. The presenter today is fine with clarifying questions during the talk. Please type them into the chat box. And if you are interested in getting a PDF copy or recording of today's presentation, we will list them in the chat box in a few days. You'll see the link listed there. Or you can contact me, tracy.gill@noaa.gov, or Gyami Shrestha, and her email is on the list. We will be happy to send you a copy if you're interested in either. If you are not on NOAA's weekly seminar list but you'd like to be, please email me at tracy.gill@noaa.gov and I will add you to the list. Folks in the room, please sign in, silence your phones. And now I will hand it over to Gyami to introduce the series. Gyami?
Thank you, Tracy. Greetings, everyone. I am Gyami Shrestha, Director of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program Office and co-host of this webinar series with Tracy Gill. Today's seminar is the fourth in a 3-month seminar series titled From Science to Solutions, the State of the Carbon Cycle, which is focused on communicating the second state of the carbon cycle report, SOCCR2, findings in relation to current and broader societal impacts and solutions. The series is sponsored by the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program in partnership with NOAA. For those who don't know about the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program, we are an interagency partnership led by the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group. We coordinate and facilitate federally funded carbon cycle research and provide leadership to the U.S. Global Change Research Program on carbon cycle science priorities. We also led the development of the second state of the carbon cycle report with a diverse team of over 200 U.S. and international experts since 2015. On behalf of my colleagues, I would like to express how much we appreciate NOAA and particularly Tracy Gill, as well as all webinar speakers for making this 14-week webinar series possible. Today's seminar title is Carbon Cycling in North America's Land-Ocean Aquatic Continuum. Our presenter is Dr. Ray Najjar from Penn State University. Dr. Najjar served as one of the 5 science leads of the second state of the carbon cycle report. In that role, he took charge of multiple chapters, ensuring appropriate cross-chapter scientific consistency. His talk today incorporates key findings from all those chapters. The chapter leads from those chapters, Dr. Lisa Marie Wyndham-Myers from the USGS, Dr. David Putman from the University of Washington, Dr. Katia Fennell from Dalhousie University, Canada, Dr. Wei-Jun Kai from the University of Delaware are also available to answer relevant questions, and Dr. Ray Najjar will elaborate on that. The Terrestrial Wetland SOCCR2 chapter, which Dr. Ray Najjar also oversaw, was already part of last Tuesday's webinar presented by Dr. Randy Kolka from USDA Forest Service. The recordings of that and prior webinars are available on the YouTube channels for the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program. Now, webinar series co-coordinator Tracy Gill will now read Dr. Ray Najjar's bio.
Hi, here's a little background on Ray. Raymond Najjar is a professor of oceanography in the Department of Meteorology and Atmospheric Science at the Pennsylvania State University, where he has been on the faculty since 1993. He earned his PhD in Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences at Princeton and was a postdoctoral fellow at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. At Penn State, he taught numerous courses in oceanography and atmospheric science. Dr. Najjar has conducted research on a variety of topics in hydrology, oceanography, and climate science, with current focal areas of research being carbon cycling in coastal waters, and the impacts of climate change on estuaries. He has co-authored more than 70 peer-reviewed studies with support from a variety of federal and state agencies. Welcome, Ray, and thanks so much for presenting your work at the NOAA Science Seminar today. Take it away.
Well, thanks, Tracy, and thanks, Gami, for both of you for the introduction and for inviting me to give the presentation. I trust that I can be heard okay? Yes, great. Okay. Well, thanks also for participating in this appropriately low carbon footprint approach to sharing information. I think we need to do this increasingly to reduce our carbon footprint, and I'm glad to participate in this way of sharing information. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free and to send them along as I'm chatting, and if I can, I'll try to answer them as we move along. I was very pleased to be part of the SOCCR report, State of the Carbon Cycle report, the second report, which has come about 10 years after the first SOCCR report, which I found to be very useful, that first report, and used it a lot in my own research. And it was really a privilege and an honor to be part of the second SOCCR report. And I want to commend Gami Shrestha for her leadership and for her cat herding, as it were, as part of that process. It was a difficult process, but very rewarding, and in no part thanks to Gami's efforts. So I'm going to be talking about sort of the aquatic chapters of the SOCCR report, which you may know is quite a large report that I think it's nearly 1,000 pages, about 20 chapters, and really covers just about every aspect of carbon cycling in North America. And I worked with really a great set of lead authors of 4 aquatic chapters. They're listed here: David Buttman, Wei-Jun Kai, Katja Fennel, Randy Kolka, and Carl Tretton, and Lisa Marie Wyndham Myers. I was really pleased to work with these excellent scientists, as well as the many co-authors that they brought on board. And I know that at least some of them are tuned into this webinar, and perhaps they could answer some of the more detailed questions if they come up. So I'll just step back a little bit and think about why the carbon cycle is important. One of the most important reasons we study the carbon cycle is because it regulates the abundance of the most important what we call non-condensable greenhouse gases. That would be carbon dioxide and methane. Water is a very important greenhouse gas, but it's condensable and therefore not really subject to manipulation in the way that carbon dioxide and methane are. So they're quite important players in this greenhouse effect, which is perfectly natural. If you were to remove all these non-condensable gases from the atmosphere, you'd very quickly have a planet that's almost completely frozen over. It's really that important and impressive. This natural greenhouse effect warms the planet by more than 30 degrees Celsius. It's really a huge impact. But carbon dioxide does other things as well. Of course, it's food for plants. It stimulates plant growth, mostly terrestrial plants, although there are some aquatic plants that are stimulated by additional CO2. Carbon dioxide regulates the pH of the ocean, and the ocean, as a result of its taking up anthropogenic, that is human-made carbon dioxide, has been acidifying. The ocean is basic, but it's becoming more acidic. Its pH is lowering as a result of absorption of carbon dioxide and the reaction of that carbon dioxide with water. And then carbon is just a way of understanding so many ecosystem processes. I mean, if we want to quantify ecosystem processes, we can do it using various elements, and carbon is a major building block of organisms, and it's a very useful way to quantify processes in the biosphere, including the overall productivity of the biosphere. And of course, human beings benefit immensely from the biosphere in no small part by our harvesting of trees and food from forests, um, through fisheries and through agriculture. So this talk, the title of the talk is inspired by a paper by Renier et al. That talked about the land-ocean aquatic continuum. And they contrast a kind of traditional way that the carbon cycle is often described and had been very commonly described and is still commonly described. And it's a view in which the land and ocean aren't really connected. So we could think of a carbon budget this way. We have fossil fuel burning contributing to the atmospheric burden of carbon dioxide. Also contributing to that burden is land use change, which through deforestation and other activities ends up releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And then about half of that carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere stays there. The units here are petagrams of carbon per year. And a petagram is 10 to the 15th grams, and turns out to be the same as a billion metric tons, or a gigaton of carbon. And so about half of that input into the atmosphere has stayed there, and the other half is roughly split between carbon dioxide that's going into the ocean and carbon dioxide that's going into intact terrestrial ecosystems, that is, ones that weren't subject to deforestation. So these are the two big, what we call sinks of carbon dioxide outside of the atmosphere, that is the open ocean and intact terrestrial ecosystems. And this view has actually served scientists fairly well. But increasingly, we've become aware of the fact that the connection between the open ocean and the land is quite important. So that's in this more modern view of the global carbon cycle, where we have this land-ocean aquatic continuum. And of course, now things are a lot more complicated. There's a lot more arrows on this figure, so the simplicity is kind of gone. But really, what's been added is this sort of middle box here. And this includes freshwater ecosystems, like one could include terrestrial wetlands in that, lakes, rivers, ponds, reservoirs. And then as you move more towards the ocean, you have tidal wetlands, estuaries, and then coastal seas. So that's the continuum. That's the continuum that connects the open ocean to intact terrestrial ecosystems. And Renier et al. Made the point that these ecosystems have been perturbed enough that they're playing a part in the anthropogenic carbon dioxide budget. So it's important to point out that all of these fluxes are perturbations from the background, the sort of natural background carbon cycle. And this is a point that I'll get to a little bit later when we talk about what's going on in North America. But what's different in this picture compared to the one previously is that there's kind of a loop here of about a half a petagram of carbon, which is, in these units is a substantial, in which you actually have more uptake of carbon by intact terrestrial ecosystems. And a good bit of that carbon is being exported laterally to freshwaters, lakes and rivers, and that's getting actually out to estuaries and the coastal ocean. And that group of aquatic systems as a whole, and there's lots of variability within them, but is itself outgassing about a half a petagram of carbon. So there's this loop here that is substantial. It's been perturbed, and it contributes to the carbon cycle to the extent that this accumulation of carbon, net accumulation of carbon in aquatic ecosystems is considerably less, in terrestrial ecosystems, is considerably less than what we had previously thought. Now, there's also a connection between these ecosystems to the open ocean. There's exchange between coastal ocean waters and the open ocean, and actually there's quite a lot of carbon exchanged between these two. But in the Renier et al. Analysis, they argue that, at least currently, that's not a large flux. In other words, the perturbation to that is not large. So that was kind of the view that we took several years ago going into the SOCCR report, at least the aquatic part of it, is that we're going to do our best to quantify the fluxes of the land-ocean aquatic system in North America. And I credit the leadership of the SOCCR report, the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group, for giving us a lot of latitude to really explore aquatic carbon cycling in this report. So there are 4 chapters in this report about aquatic systems, and I believe in the first SOCCR report, I think there were 2. There was a wetlands chapter, and I believe there was an ocean chapter. So it's been sort of broken out considerably in this work, and I think as a result of being given a lot of leeway, we were really able to learn quite a bit. So that's the context for the chapters I'll present in the State of the Carbon Cycle report. Here's a link to the report itself, so you could read all the gory details about the individual chapters, the aquatic chapters, and of course all the other chapters, and how they fit into the larger context of the report. And in this talk, I'll really be presenting kind of a 30,000-foot view of the land-ocean aquatic continuum. I'm not going to be getting into the details of the methodology, which you may find frustrating, but it'll allow us to kind of focus on the big picture. And if you're interested, you can zoom in to the reports and learn more about how we came up with these numbers. So as I said, there are 4 chapters, chapters 13 to 16, and I've already named the co-authors. At least one of them is on. I believe David Buttman is on. I know there are some chapter co-authors on as well, such as Liz Canuel and others. So perhaps they can answer detailed questions if they come up. But yeah, the 4 chapters are terrestrial wetlands, it's non-tidal wetlands, inland waters, by which we mean lakes, rivers, streams, reservoirs, that kind of thing, tidal wetlands and estuaries, and then the coastal ocean and continental shelves. So, these are boundary systems, right, between the land and the ocean. And boundaries are fractal. They're very messy. They're very heterogeneous. It's difficult to quantify fluxes in such heterogeneous systems. And the report really used a whole variety of techniques to get at budgets. And that's a big part of what the SOCCR report is about, is quantifying the budget as best as possible. It's not the only thing that the report does, but that's kind of what I'll be focusing on. And so there's a combination of literature review, data synthesis, there's use of models, which are kind of mechanistic and process-based computer models, as well as inverse models and empirical models. And there was really, the chapters differed quite a lot in their overall approach. Some really just stuck with the literature. Others dove into databases and did some of their own analysis of published databases. And I'll call out the terrestrial wetlands chapter there. They did quite a lot of analysis of existing published databases, and really were able to push forward the science there, I believe. Okay, so we had to come up with a definition for the domain, the aquatic domain, and the hardest part is defining the outer edge of the land-ocean aquatic continuum, where the coastal ocean meets the open ocean. And there are a lot of different definitions of this. They can be based on depth, they can be based on temperature, salinity is a common use. And we decided to go with one based on distance from shore, or largely based on distance from shore, which also has the advantage of having some, it's also a political boundary as well. So we used the exclusive economic zone. And this was actually the recommended boundary from a report about North American margins. It came out, I believe, in 2005 that Burke Hales, Wei-Jun Kai, and others had written. They suggested that this is the boundary that should be used in coastal carbon budgeting. So that's the approach we went with here. Okay, so we're going to get right to the results, and I'm going to be spending a lot of time talking about this figure here. And this summarizes the 4 chapters in the kind of budget framework. And there are fluxes here and teragrams of carbon per year. A teragram is 10 to the 12th grams. And that turns out to be 1 million metric tons. And, you know, in the middle, we have basically our aquatic domain, this sort of land, ocean, aquatic continuum, if you will. And at the top, we have the atmosphere, and at the bottom, we have sediments or soil. And we worked very hard to quantify exchanges with the atmosphere here, and a loss to sediments and soil, as well as these lateral exchanges between, you know, we're basically going from left to right, we're going downstream into the ocean, and we worked on quantifying these. And here we also needed to estimate errors in these fluxes, which was not always easy to do. Sometimes we had statistical approaches that we could rely on, and sometimes we had to just use expert judgment for that. So we have sort of 3 levels that are indicated here. We have a 95% confidence that the actual value is either within 25, 50, or 100% of the reported value. And one thing you might notice is that although we have lots of numbers here, that a lot of them are quite uncertain, and some where we have a very large uncertainty range, you know, going basically from 0 to twice the value. Okay, so let's start with the exchange with the atmosphere. What we see is that, you know, sort of the bottom line is that these are large fluxes, and I'll put this in the North American context later, but the net, I'll just tell you right now that the net land sink over North America is on the order of 600 teragrams of carbon per year. So these numbers are, you know, these are comparable, right? The same order of magnitude. So right off the bat, we're seeing that the land-ocean aquatic continuum is a significant part of the North American carbon cycle. And what we see is that there are large compensating fluxes on the order of 260 to 270 teragrams of uptake and about the same that's released. So drilling down a little bit more, see, I lost my cursor. There it is. Okay. So you can see, for example, that terrestrial wetlands take up 82 teragrams of carbon from the atmosphere. Inland waters release about 250 teragrams of carbon. Tidal wetlands and estuaries are relatively modest contributors to the North American carbon budget. Tidal wetlands take up about 27 teragrams, and estuaries release about 10. And the coastal ocean is a fairly large sink of atmospheric CO2. It takes up about 160 teragrams of carbon. So we see that in terms of exchange with the atmosphere, terrestrial wetlands, inland waters, and the coastal ocean are pretty substantial players in the North American carbon cycle. Now we could move to the lateral fluxes, and we can see that these are large as well. And we see that there's a lot of carbon going from some terrestrial sources, which are not well characterized. And in fact, this number here, this 491 teragrams of carbon per year that's going into inland waters from what we're calling other terrestrial sources, is calculated by difference. So in the inland waters chapter, estimates were made of the burial, of the evasion to the atmosphere, and then the lateral transport to estuaries. And that must be balanced by input from terrestrial systems. We have an estimate from the terrestrial chapter that dissolved organic carbon fluxes from terrestrial wetlands amount to about 16, which is a very small fraction of what's being lost from inland waters, and that must be made up by this unknown terrestrial source. This could be runoff, for example, from surface water and groundwater into inland waters of dissolved inorganic carbon or organic carbon and so forth. So there's a lot going into inland waters. There's a fair bit going out into estuaries. A lot of that passes through estuaries to a large extent from a total carbon viewpoint. There's actually a lot of transformation that goes on in estuaries in terms of the form of carbon, but if we're just tracking carbon regardless of its form, it looks like it's just passing straight through. And that goes out to the coastal ocean, and the coastal ocean exports even more than it imports laterally out to the open ocean. And again, this number here is determined by difference in order to balance the budget. And in this case, the coastal ocean, many of the numbers were arrived at using a combination of numerical models and some data synthesis. Okay, so the lateral fluxes are large, and lateral fluxes, by the way, are exclusive to the aquatic domain. You don't really have lateral fluxes on land, although you do, of course, you do have them in the atmosphere as well. Okay, let's go to the burial. Again, these are, when you add them up, they're significant numbers compared to, say, the net land sink. This is almost 300 teragrams of carbon are being buried. A lot of that is happening. A lot of that is happening in inland waters here, but terrestrial wetlands and the coastal ocean also are significant contributors to burial. Now, maybe I should have mentioned this earlier. I should have mentioned this earlier, is that we're not able to distinguish between the anthropogenic fluxes and natural fluxes. So all of these except if the one exception is in the coastal ocean, where we have a numerical modeling study that distinguishes them. But everything you're seeing here in this budget are the total fluxes, which are the natural background fluxes with the anthropogenic perturbation superimposed on top of it. So that's a real challenge for the future is how do we separate natural from anthropogenic carbon fluxes. All right, I'd like to emphasize really the progress we've made over the past 10 years. So I'm showing the same figure again, but what I've superimposed on it are the numbers that we had from SOCCR2, all of the numbers that we had regarding aquatic systems from the first SOCCR report. So we had, and I believe Carl Tretton was also, who was a co-author on the terrestrial wetlands chapter here, was also a co-author on the SOCCR1 chapter. We've improved this number. The uptake is better constrained now at 82 teragrams of carbon per year by terrestrial wetlands. It used to be 49. There was a burial estimate in inland waters of 25 teragrams of carbon per year. That's been considerably improved. It's much larger now. The lateral export to the coastal ocean, which we actually, this is one of the numbers we know the best. You can see that this has 4 stars next to it. So we have 95% confidence that this 105 is that it's within 25% of the correct number. So that's a big improvement. And the previous synthesis of coastal ocean was purely data-based estimate, which we've also done in this report. But previous synthesis argued that North American waters were neutral. Now, it was slightly different domain. And actually, you can see also these numbers are different domains as well. We only had numbers for the US, for inland water burial, and for lateral export. We only had numbers for the US lateral export to estuaries. So here for the coastal ocean, the domain size is a little bit different. It's quite a bit narrower. It's 100 kilometers as opposed to the 200 nautical miles that were used here. Okay. So if you look at everything else is new. The inland water evasion, most of the burial estimates, the evasion from estuaries, most of these lateral transports. This is all new information, and not that we know it extremely well, but we were able to do a lot of synthesis and come up with error estimates for all of these fluxes. All right, so now putting this into some North American context, and this is the number I had been referring to before, the net land sink, and I'm sorry if this is rather small, but the net land sink over North America is about 600 teragrams per year. And you can see some of the numbers we've been talking about listed here. Some of them have been added together, like the burial in coastal waters, I believe, includes tidal wetlands and estuaries as well as shelf waters. But you can see these numbers are not small compared to this net land sink. So the land-ocean aquatic continuum is a significant part of carbon cycling in North America. All right, I'll sort of wrap up with some of the other highlights that came out of the chapters. It wasn't just about the budget that I talked about. There's a lot of work that was done sort of defining the limits of our knowledge and articulating where new research needs to be done. In the wetland chapter, they really made a lot of progress with methane, whereas the other aquatic chapters, we just didn't have the information really to say too much about methane emissions, although a little bit was done in the tidal wetlands chapter. But what turns out that methane emissions are large enough from terrestrial wetlands that they affect the total carbon budget. So the wetland methane emissions, they offset about a third of the wetland CO2 uptake from the atmosphere. And these North American wetlands are really, it's pretty remarkable. You know, they're globally significant. So about a third of global wetland emissions of methane are, I should make that clear. This is methane here in the second bullet. Is from North America. So really, you know, we have globally significant fluxes. The wetlands chapter also looked at, you know, a very important issue. Wetlands serve many services to us, and they're important well beyond their importance to the carbon cycle. Of course, they're important for cleaning water and providing vital habitat for numerous fauna. And there's a lot of concern about wetland loss. And the good news is that the current rate of wetland loss is much less than historical rates. And you know, this is thanks to regulation, I would assume, and now restoration and creation of new wetlands nearly offsets natural wetland loss. But you know, Carl Tretton and Randy Kolka warn us, you know, not to get too excited about that, because we're really not sure about how functional these new wetlands are. For example, in their carbon sequestering abilities, their water quality improvement characteristics, and things like that. So there's a good deal of research that needs to be done about establishing the quality of these new wetlands and what kind of services they provide. Chapter 14, I'm emphasizing here the new research that needs to be done. There really wasn't anything done about methane in this chapter, and that's an important step that needs to be taken, is to quantify methane emissions from inland waters. There's a need to better represent storms and other extreme events. There's some research that suggests that carbon fluxes can be concentrated in very short-term events, so that the lion's share of a system's emission, for example, might or transport to the coastal ocean might take place in just a handful of events, and they might be missed by more traditional sampling. And then finally, they argue that there's a need for standardization of measurement techniques, particularly for things like the inorganic carbon system, and they could build on a work that's the sort of coordination work that's been done by marine scientists. In Chapter 15, new research or needed research that was emphasized is understanding responses to accelerated sea level rise, and we're already starting to see that accelerated sea level rise throughout North America. Remarkably, we don't have good mapping of tidal wetlands and estuaries. The U.S. is in pretty good shape, but the variability within the U.S. is not very good. Spatial variability, the temporal variability year to year, and actually this is a problem that we're seeing worldwide, that tidal wetlands are very poorly mapped, and perhaps we could take a leadership role in improving techniques for mapping wetlands and estuaries. And then there's a need to quantify carbon dioxide and methane exchange in large, undersampled, and rapidly changing regions. The terrestrial community has done pretty well with flux towers for measuring carbon and methane fluxes between the atmosphere and terrestrial ecosystems. And tidal wetland community and estuarine community is starting to take advantage of those techniques, but there's a lot of work to do. And then finally, in Chapter 16, they emphasized that the net uptake of atmospheric CO2, that was that number that was order of 160 teragrams of carbon per year by the coastal ocean, it's actually driven primarily by high latitude regions. This chapter also looked at ocean acidification, and they found that low pH conditions occur in Arctic and North Pacific coastal waters, and these low pH conditions are being exacerbated by the uptake of anthropogenic CO2. And then finally, a combination of expanded monitoring, data synthesis, and numerical modeling is required to provide more reliable coastal carbon budgets and future projections of the coastal ocean, including the contribution of anthropogenic CO2 to those budgets. Okay, so in summary, what have we learned? And I'm sort of getting back to the carbon budget synthesis. We learned from SOCCR2 that aquatic systems play a prominent role in the North American carbon budget. That exchanges with the atmosphere are large, but they're often offsetting, plus or minus 200 to 300 teragrams of carbon per year. And that lateral transfers and burial are large and exclusive to aquatic ecosystems. Lateral transfers are on the order of 500 teragrams of carbon per year to inland waters, and about 100 teragrams of carbon per year to estuaries, coastal waters, and the open ocean. And there's a good deal of burial happening in North American aquatic systems on the order of 300 teragrams of carbon. So that wraps up my presentation. Thanks for your interest and attention. You can find out more about me at my website here. Feel free to contact me by email with any questions, or you can even give me a call. Old school, go for it. And if you want more information about the second State of the Carbon Cycle report, there's the web link there. I believe GAMI's also given some information as well. And I believe that does it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ray. That was a great summary. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to let other people ask theirs. I see you have some questions coming on the line now. And Ray, if you would go ahead and read the questions when they come in.
Sure.
Thanks. Well, while we're waiting for the questions, I have a question. Has SOCCR2 helped managers and legislators prioritize what needs to be done, a way forward? Is there a way forward in SOCCR2? I didn't read it, and I'm sad to say I've skimmed it, but do they give like specific ideas on how to move forward, or is it not intended to do that?
Well, we're careful about not being policy prescriptive, but because that's not part of our mandate, but we want to be policy relevant. So we, and throughout the report, we argue that, for example, if we want to reduce emissions, here are some places where we could make progress. And there are some good news in terms of emissions from the SOCCR2 report. Emissions, and you'll see this in some of the other higher level talks. I think Rich Birdsey is giving one, and Dan Hayes. And anthropogenic emissions have actually gone down, while the economy has really done quite well over the time period that the SOCCR report focused on, roughly the past 10 years or so. So it's an example of how we can move towards a low carbon future while still maintaining economic vitality.
Okay, thank you. And you do have.
So, yeah, would you like me to read that?
Please.
Yeah, Christine Negra asks, other examples of condensed effects like storm-driven lateral transfers. For example, any spatial hotspots for carbon transfers to/from terrestrial wetlands. I think the hot spots and hot moments is kind of a hot topic in the hydrological world. I have a collaborator at Virginia Tech. His name is Zach Easton, and he works on these hot spots. And Heather Gall, also here at Penn State, works on hot moments. Mostly in what I've seen has been mostly in terms of the nitrogen cycle, like hotspots of denitrification and other things. I'm personally not aware. I'm an oceanographer, and I'm not really aware of what's happening in the terrestrial. Less aware, I should say, what's happening in the terrestrial wetland literature. I don't know if there's others on the line that might be willing to chime in. Trying to see who's here. I know Carl Tretton said he might call in, but actually I don't see him. And I don't see Randy Kolka either. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in about that, but
we could provide their emails if you want to follow up with them, Christine, right, Ray?
Sure, yes.
Okay, are there any other questions? Yami's made the point that this recording and the PDF of this presentation will be, she's telling the channel where it will be available, and the PDF will be available further up on the chat box. She has a link to where the link to the recording and the PDF will be. Well, thank you, Ray. It looks like there's no more, maybe one more. We'll see David Buttman. Thanks. Okay. All right, well, thanks for joining us, everyone. And Ray, thank you so much for presenting today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
All right, and Yami's sending out a few more bits. Thank you, everybody, and we hope to see you next Tuesday for our next event. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.